All right. I want to thank everybody for joining us today as we release our latest version of Dangerous by Design, a really important report on an important issue. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Beth Osborne. I'm the Vice President for Transportation and Thriving Communities at Smart Growth America. And Smart Growth America is a national nonprofit that envisions a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. The National Complete Streets Coalition is a project of Smart Growth America. It's an alliance of public interest organizations and transportation professionals committed to the safety of our nation's roadways through the development and implementation of complete streets policies and practices. Today, we're releasing Dangerous by Design for 2022. I am going to briefly outline report findings, and then my colleague, Rayla Bellis, is going to dig deeper into them. We are also going to hear from some important leaders in seeking more pedestrian-friendly roads and overall safe roads. We'll hear from Joe Martinez, an advocate whose son was struck and killed by a driver of a car in Fresno, California in 2013. We'll then hear from Mayor Regina Romero of Tucson, Arizona. Tucson is our 13th most deadly city on our list this year, something Mayor Romero is working very hard to address. And finally, we'll hear from Chaps Poduri, a council member in Pacific Grove, California, who's also working hard to improve roadway safety. Once the presentations are completed, we're going to open up for questions, but rather than asking people to raise their hand, we are asking that you put your name and outlet in the chat box and note that you have a question. This will allow us to keep things a little more organized, and we'll ask you by name to turn off mute and ask your questions. I do want to remind people that this report is embargoed and it will be embargoed until midnight tonight. Setting up interviews or asking further questions is certainly something we encourage, and you should reach out to our communications director, Eric Kova, to do that. Now I am going to go over some of the top level findings from the report. Well, the first thing I hope you notice here is that pedestrian fatalities are up a staggering 62% since they began steadily rising in 2009. This upward trend has been going on for more than a decade now, after generally trending downward for most of the early 2000s. The report also finds that 6,529 people were struck and killed while walking in 2020. An average of nearly 18 people per day, and a 4.7% increase over 2019, even as driving decreased in 2020. From the Governor's Highway Safety Administration's preliminary estimates, we have even worse news for 2021. We expect a further increase to between 11 and 13% higher in terms of pedestrian fatalities in 2020, another historic jump. If this number holds, it would be the highest number of pedestrian fatalities in 40 years. So what's going on? Driving decreases, but fatalities go up. And one thing I do want to point out, it's not just pedestrian fatalities that are up, it is overall fatalities. But congestion, something that transportation agencies and we as a nation spend billions to eliminate, seems to have been slowing traffic, and slower traffic reduces deadly crashes. During COVID, with less traffic on the road, car speeds increased to more free-flowing conditions and the speed that drivers felt most comfortable driving based on the wide, highway-like road design we find across most of our country, leading to more deadly interactions between pedestrians and drivers. And one thing that sadly the pandemic did not change. Black Americans are being killed at double, and Native Americans nearly 3 times the rate of white Americans. So the burden of this danger is being disproportionately felt by Black and Native Americans. Moving on to the next slide. Excellent. Nearly everywhere is getting worse. And for those that did not get worse, they really stayed basically the same. There were a few places with very marginal decreases in their danger rate, but overall, the trend is consistent. Danger is increasing everywhere. Comparing the average fatality rate for the past 5 years of data that are available, that's 2016 through 2020, with the previous 5 years, 2011 through 2015, 81 metropolitan areas got more dangerous, and only 19 saw lower fatality rates, albeit with marginal decreases. Only 4 states, New York, North Dakota, Massachusetts, and Montana, plus the District of Columbia, had a decrease in fatalities over the past 5 years when compared with the previous 5 years. And the baseline rates have only been getting worse over the last decade. As this graphic shows, a fatality rate that would have topped these rankings 5 years ago is only good enough for the 9th most deadly this time around. While there are plenty of examples of successful safety improvements on specific corridors, this approach is failing to make a meaningful dent in the overall fatality rates because it's not enough to fix one corridor. We have to fix every corridor. Safety has to be the default. Going on to the next slide and demonstrating that nearly everywhere is getting more dangerous. As I said, comparing the average fatality rate over the past 5 years, 2016 to 2020, with the previous 5 years, 81 metro areas got worse. Things have gotten so bad that while our former #1 most dangerous metropolitan statistical area, Orlando, got more dangerous, 7 other cities did worse still and have now leapfrogged Orlando. Only 4 states, like I said before, plus the District of Columbia, saw a decrease in fatalities. Every remaining state saw an increase. So I know rankings grab people's attention, but in this case, sadly, a drop in the rankings is not at all good news. It just means someone else had even worse news. Also, I do have to point out that those not in the top 20 have nothing to brag about. Being amongst the safest of the cities or states in the United States of America still means you are among the most dangerous in the world. So we do want to point out those performing the least well in the United States, but every place across the United States compares terribly to our peers across the world. Our peers across the world who see many of the same factors we do with distraction and the challenges from COVID, but are able to protect their citizens better than us. So I'm going to hand things over to Mayor Regina Romero of Tucson, Arizona, a wonderful leader in this area, someone who is working very hard to improve roadway safety in her city. Mayor Romero, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Beth, and to Rayla and all of the team at Smart Growth America. Really appreciate all of the incredible work that you're doing to inform policymakers like myself, but also to inform the country of what is happening in terms of our roadways. I also want to have a special mention to Mr. Martinez and, give him my condolences for losing his son to a speeding driver. And unfortunately, the numbers of people, pedestrians and cyclists killed on our roadways is increasing. And this is an urgency that we have to work to reduce. Also want to say a special thank you to my colleague, Councilmember Poduri from Pacific Grove, California. Want to make sure that you all understand, those that are out there listening to this panel, that it is in American cities where we are finding solutions to create safe cities for all. And here in Tucson, Arizona, Tucson being the 13th most dangerous city for pedestrians and cyclists, we have been seeing these numbers rising the last few years. And as a council member, before I became mayor of the city of Tucson, we started the work to bring attention to this epidemic of not having safe streets for all. And so we started here in Tucson creating a citizen task force so that we could create safe and complete streets for all. This happened back in 2018. And since then, we've been laser focused on bringing attention of creating streets that everyone can feel safe in. That's why most recently, we passed, as I led on, and the voters in Tucson, Arizona passed Proposition 411 that dedicates more than $750 million to fixing residential roads and dedicates $150 million within the next 10 years to create safe streets for pedestrians and cyclists. And most recently in May of this year, I led on adding to mayor and council agenda, and we gave direction to our city manager to prepare us as a city to become a Vision Zero city. Which basically we've been working on pedestrian and cycling safety elements and creating complete and safe streets for all. But Vision Zero gets you to a point where you become much more competitive for federal grants and other foundation grants so that we can continue in investing in infrastructure that will create safe streets and a safe city for all. So I just want to note as well that it's not Tucson alone, right? Arizona is the fourth most dangerous state for pedestrians and bicyclists. So it's an awful trend for Arizona and of course Tucson to be part of, but I think that here in Tucson, Arizona, the mayor and council, the residents of our city have said very clearly that this has to change. Most recently, in a regional transportation authority project on First Avenue, which is one of our most dangerous streets in the city of Tucson, both businesses and residents and stakeholders that use First Avenue said that they wanted a 5-lane road that focused on pedestrian and bicycle safety. And they said no to an 8-lane, I believe it's a 6-lane road that will just move traffic. What residents and businesses here in the city of Tucson want in much safer streets that are inclusive to multimodal modes of transportation, and that includes pedestrians and cyclists. And I'll mention this as well, which is it's ironic because the city of Tucson is a very well-known city for being a bicycle city. We're rated very highly as a bicycle and cyclist friendly city. We have the Tour of Tucson, which is attended every November by people around the world. But what we have to do is create much more safe infrastructure, and that's what we're doing. We're on our way to becoming a much safer city for all. So I just wanted to make sure that we mention a couple of ironic things, right? Because we value, as Tucsonans, we value cycling and bicycling in our city. We have created hundreds of miles of bike boulevards and infrastructure for bicyclists, but yet we are becoming more and more dangerous for pedestrians and cyclists in our city. So that's why policymakers like myself and my council colleagues are pushing aggressively for Vision Zero, but also trying to apply for Safe Streets for All funding from the bipartisan infrastructure bill that we will use our proposition for $1,150 million as match so that we can continue moving towards a safer place and a safer city for pedestrians and bicyclists and drivers as well.
Thank you so much, Mayor Romero. I do want to point people to two things. One, a video that we did on the work Tucson has undertaken under the mayor's leadership to improve safety. And I also want to mention their really excellent complete streets policy, a policy that we generally point out as one of, if not the best in the nation right now. And one of the things that makes it so great is it is not just a statement of intent, it is a statement of action with a clear implementation plan for specific areas of change and policies that need to be revised. And that is what we're excited to see the outcomes of that work and watch other areas follow in your footsteps.
Thank you so much, Beth. I really appreciate it. And it really is our action plans here in Tucson are action plans, right? They have goals that we need to meet and steps that we need to follow to get to where we need to. So I really appreciate it. I appreciate the leadership of Smart Growth America in helping refine our action plans here in the city of Tucson and helping making sure that we are used as a model nationwide. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you. So I'm going to dig a little bit into some of the issues with regard to the report. The major issue I want to focus on is that, while driving went down, fatalities went up. And I think this is an area that requires some real attention and really points to the fact that a lot of our firmly held beliefs in the past were not true. And therefore, some of the myths that we still hold on to should be revisited. One of the biggest myths was that these deaths were inevitable. As driving increased, we would see fatalities increase, but as driving decreased, we would also see deaths decrease. Well, we saw driving decrease and deaths increased by shocking amounts. So it points out there is something here that needs attention, especially considering the fact that nearly every other peer country started with a better safety record than the United States, and then saw pedestrian fatalities and overall fatalities decrease during the pandemic. So we faced the same thing that the world did, but we saw fatalities go up and danger get worse, despite other variables being largely the same. Our partners at Streetlight Data showed that walking trips increased during the pandemic in every state and metro area we analyzed, regardless of climate or geography. It showed that there's a huge demand for walking across the country. But more walking only led to more deaths in some places. Cities with higher historic walking commute rates had much lower increases in pedestrian fatality rates. And cities that had a low historic walking commute rate, despite similar increases in walking rates, saw a much larger increase in fatalities. So areas that were inviting to walk in, areas where they were so inviting to walk in that people were more likely to commute by foot, those areas had a feeling of safety before the pandemic and showed greater safety results during the pandemic than those that had not created that same inviting nature for folks to get out of the car in their normal commutes. And I'd like to look at some of the factors that lead to that issue. Design has a huge impact on behavior, often more of an impact than speed limits, because we only see speed limit signs from time to time, but the design is all around us all the time. As you can see here, this is a wide, straight road that it has a look that is quite similar to highways, even separated highways. The only difference here is there's lots of destinations and lots of points of conflict that make that highway design inherently dangerous. High speeds and lots of points of conflict are a recipe for crashes. They're a recipe for mistakes, and they're a recipe for deadly mistakes. Other streets along this roadway regularly intersect, but lack crosswalks or signals, because the goal is to keep the vehicles from having to stop, to keep them moving speedily. That is prioritized ahead of providing frequent crossings. There are numerous destinations across this corridor, many of which are right across the street from each other. But marked signalized crosswalks are located as much as 0.4 miles apart, potentially requiring a 10-minute round trip to reach a destination that's directly across the street. I want to stop on that for just a second, because if people are expected to wait through 2 signals, that is considered a massive failure in transportation that requires a huge change and big investment to change. And 2 signals, you're generally talking about maybe 2 minutes, but a 10-minute walk for a pedestrian, maybe someone using a walker or carrying groceries or carrying a toddler, that is considered totally acceptable, because the priority is to keep the vehicles moving, not to make it possible to move around safely outside of a car. And the last thing I'll point out here is that sidewalks do exist, but look at the portion of the roadway available for people outside of a car versus all of the space for the car. Those sidewalks and the crossings are mostly an afterthought. 60% of all 2020 deaths occurred on non-interstate arterial highways like this one in Memphis, Tennessee. If you only look at urban areas, it's over 70% of the fatalities occur here. So, and these arterials make up only about 15% of our roadways. So if we target our energy, we can make a difference. From here, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Rayla Bellis, who's going to dig deeper into the findings of this report.
Thank you, Beth. Hi, everyone. My name is Rayla Bellis. I'm the Director of Thriving Communities here at Smart Growth America, and I have coordinated the development of this report, Dangerous by Design, for the past couple editions. So as Beth said, I'm going to hopefully very briefly walk you through some of our findings in a little bit more detail. Before I do, I'll just say a couple words about our methodology. This report ranks states and metro areas based on their deaths per capita, specifically deaths per 100,000 population. And to do that, we look at 5 years of data, 2016 to 2020, using the Fatality Analysis Reporting System, or FARS, from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. There's a bit of a lag with this data when it comes out, so 2020 is the most recent data we have available, though as Beth has said, preliminary estimates show that 2021 is looking even more deadly for people walking. We made some changes to our approach for this report as a result of the pandemic. We used to include a metric of commute trips taken by walking as part of our ranking. We realized that the changes to travel patterns resulting from the pandemic, many of which are likely to be somewhat permanent, no longer made this an approach that makes sense. So the rankings aren't directly comparable to the rankings in our previous reports, but I do want to reemphasize what Beth said, which is that despite shifts in ranking, most places' death rates are trending worse, significantly worse in many cases over time. I'll just briefly show this again. These are our top 20 most deadly metro areas for the years 2016 to 2020. And as you can see again in this chart on the right, many places have surpassed the fatality rate of our most deadly metro area from the previous 5 years, before these 5 years that we're looking at. The only other thing I'll mention here is that As with previous editions of this report, the southern half of the US is heavily represented on this list of most deadly metro areas. This is not a big surprise because many of these metro areas grew and developed after automobile ownership was already widespread. So they're built at a driving scale where high-speed vehicle travel has been the priority in development. For this report, we also wanted to dig into which metro areas and states saw the biggest jump in fatality rates during the pandemic, specifically looking at 2020 compared to the previous 4 years, 2016 to 2019. You can see these are the 10 metro areas that saw the biggest increases in fatality rates during the pandemic, during 2020. But 67 metro areas saw an increase in fatality rates. So about 2/3 got more deadly in 2020 compared to the previous 4 years. Our report also ranks states based on which are most deadly, again, using deaths per 100,000 population. These are our 20 most dangerous states as of this report, looking at 2016 through 2020 fatalities. What I want to draw your attention to in this case is the significant increases in fatality rates for many of our top 20 states when looking at 2016 to 2020 compared to the previous 4 years, 5 years, 2011 to 2015. New Mexico in particular had a really staggering increase in its fatality rate, and it has become the #1 state in terms of pedestrian fatalities as a result, as of this report. And again, we also looked at which states saw big jumps in their fatality rates during the pandemic specifically. These are the states that saw the biggest increases in 2020 compared to the previous 4 years in terms of people being struck and killed while walking. Several of these states, the top 4 on this list, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, South Dakota, not only got significantly more deadly, but also were in our top 20 list as well. This report also looks at who's most vulnerable to being struck and killed while walking. As Beth said, the pandemic perpetuated disparities that we've seen in previous editions of this report. People of color are significantly more likely to be struck and killed while walking, and in particular, Black Americans are twice as likely as white non-Hispanic Americans to be struck and killed while walking, and Native Americans are almost 3 times as likely. We also look at by age who's most vulnerable to being struck and killed while walking, and people 50 to 64 as well as 75 and older are especially vulnerable, especially overrepresented in these crashes, given that our population as a country is aging. I think we can expect to see this get worse and more pronounced if nothing changes. And our report also digs into which neighborhoods are most deadly for people walking by median income level. And you can see a very clear trend here that lower income neighborhoods are much more heavily represented in these deaths, despite being a smaller share of the population. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our next guest speaker, Joe Martinez. We're really grateful to have him with us. Joe's son, again, was tragically struck and killed in Fresno back in 2013, which is one of the current most deadly metro areas. So Joe, thank you again for joining us. Joe, you may need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now, Rayla?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I would like to first thank the mayor for her heartfelt comments. I really appreciate that, Mayor Romero. So thank you for your support. As stated, my name is Joe Martinez. I live in Fresno. Fresno is the 4th largest city in California. And according to the Dangerous by Design report, Fresno is ranked number 10 as the most deadliest metropolitan city in the nation for pedestrians. I am angry and I am troubled by this horrible, horrific news. It's been 9 agonizing years since losing my 21-year-old son, Paul. On June 5th, 2013, a speeding driver going 54 miles per hour on a 40-mile-per-hour road struck my only son as he was crossing the street. Paul was rushed to the hospital and fought valiantly to live. But after 1 hour, which a team of ER doctors tried desperately to save his young life, Paul succumbed to his injuries. I had been waiting, I had been praying for a miracle, but instead, after kissing my son for the last time and hugging his lifeless body, I left the hospital with blood on my face and on my clothes. Although I'm grateful for the street improvements around the crash site made by our city over the years, there still remains a lot more streets throughout our city that are not safe, and more needs to be done to make sure everyone is safe, no matter who you are and where you live. No one should ever fear to walk or ride a bike using our roads. As a grieving parent turned safety advocate, I'm urging our elected officials to make safety over speed a priority. When it comes to road design, demanding that we fight for funding to make safety improvements on our streets, especially in low-income neighborhoods where people of color are more likely to be struck or killed. We need to adopt and implement safe systems approach for reducing injuries and saving lives from preventable crash collisions. And finally, as we've heard Mayor Romero talk about Vision Zero in our city and throughout the nation, we need to endorse and implement Vision Zero as a strategy to eliminate all traffic fatalities and severe injuries while increasing safe, healthy, equitable mobility for all. And finally, since Paul's death, it's never easy to forget, but life has become more manageable over the years. I have found my voice so that no parent should ever experience the pain of losing a child, or no other young person's life is cut short in order to have safe streets. I'm raising my voice to ask our national, our state, our local leaders to do something about it. We want speed reduction, and we want smarter and safe road design now. I want to thank the mayor, the council member, the staff from Smart Growth America, Families for Safe Streets, and all of our guests, including the media, for allowing me to share this personal story. And every day, I miss Paul. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. We shouldn't have to wait for a parent to lose their child to make improvements to a road. We see the danger on a day-to-day basis. And I hope that our elected leaders hear your call today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand things over now to Councilmember Poduri, who's going to talk about his efforts as a leading elected official in California to address roadway safety.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth. And I would like to thank Smart Growth America, the National Complete Streets Coalition, the CDC, Mayor Romero over here, Mr. Martinez, all of you, the media that are present here for this briefing. This is a very important topic that I am heavily invested in, as you can see. But I'll start with some background here so you understand that while we're talking about metropolitan cities, really every city, this is happening. This is a national crisis. So from a California standpoint, being that I'm from California, crashes rank as the 5th leading cause of death in California. And among those car crashes, speeding is the most, I would say, dangerous cause. Today, CA California is ranked 9th most deadly state for pedestrians, who are really the most impacted by such speeding accidents. And the likelihood of survival for a pedestrian that is struck by a car at 20 miles per hour is 90%. You double that, 40 miles per hour, that likelihood of survival drops to 20%. We all need to be careful about speeding. and what we're doing here to make safety paramount. So as we look at, I would say, statistics and facts in metro areas, which is where the report is concentrated on, I would like to mention again that non-metro areas like my city are not really immune from speeding or crashes. So I live in Pacific Grove, which is a small coastal town in California, roughly about 3 square miles. And what started off as a Methodist campground retreat in the 1800s, late 1800s, is now a full-fledged city. And so the road system that has evolved from this 130-year-old history has been characterized by really initial developments of Victorian homes. But when you think about Victorian homes at that time, little to no parking. And then slowly a grid pattern emerged, which is now downtown Pacific Grove. And then we annexed some more land to make it a complete, complete the street system, really. And throughout this history, it has been an automobile-focused design. There's only been one component of focus: how to actually get automobiles inside and outside the city. And so this state of affairs has really manifested itself into now what we have is a 5-way intersection in this small town, which also happens to be a state highway. And to compound all these matters, that 5-way intersection is right next to schools. And so over the years, because of this design component, the city has made workarounds. They have introduced crosswalks, they've introduced stop signs and such, but this hasn't really precluded any accidents. A high school student and a freshman were both struck by cars in 2019 and 2020. So what is our plan for moving forward? So really Smart Growth America, the program that they have, the Champions Institute, has guided me last year to really rethink safety, re-examine the tool set that is being offered to us as elected officials to make changes within the city. And as you can see by the Dangerous by Report design, it makes it alarmingly clear we need to act now. And so earlier this year, the city passed a resolution supporting complete streets by means of the Active People, Healthy Nations initiative. And now, in conjunction with Smart Growth America, I'm embarking upon a project to improve the safety at the 5-way intersection. We're also taking other initiatives into account, like Vision Zero, making a complete streets policy, et cetera. But really this project, I want to highlight this to the city to say, how can we make safety a priority for all of us? And by all, I mean really all. So the first, the city is taking steps to examine the design of the intersection. We're taking into account equity, safety, and multimodal access. And the next steps are evaluation and design and community involvement, which are all going to happen during this fiscal year. Really, if you're looking at it, we're turning back time in a different manner. Everything is now a human-centered approach as opposed to an automobile-centered approach. And as this project kicks off and it gains steam, I would like to mention that really safety, to implement safety, we really need a all hands on deck kind of approach. And that means elected officials. That means, in my case, regional transportation agencies, state transportation agencies, community stakeholders. Everybody needs to get involved to really make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Poduri. I have to say that so many times we hear people assume that walkability is something really only of interest to and needed by large urban areas. And it's such a dismissive attitude, because not only are there so many people in beautiful small towns like Pacific Grove, but also we can learn so much from those small towns and what they are doing to create that sense of place in the middle of the towns. Not all of small town and rural town America is the great wide open. There are places where people live in close quarters with one another and go to spend time and move around outside of a car. And I really appreciate your leadership in creating those great smaller places. So thank you for being here and for all of your work in this area. I think at this point, we are open for questions, and I believe the first request for a question came from Mark Harper with Daytona Beach.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I guess it boils down to why does Florida have so many cities in the top 20?
Well, I think Florida has so many cities in the top 20 because so many of them grew up in the post-vehicle world. Didn't have as much of historic walkable centers that many areas had built up. And as these communities built up around the car, Florida really embraced the idea of building these vast highway-like roadways in places where they don't belong. Back in the 50s, we built our interstate highway system because we knew having speeds like 40, 45, 50, 55 were inherently dangerous in our communities. So we separated them. We created separated highway systems and interstate systems. But somehow since the 50s, we forgot that. And we started building them in places that are rich with conflict, with driveways and cross streets and people. And I believe that several of the speakers today, including myself, mentioned that at higher speed, there's greater chance for mistake, and that mistake is more likely to be deadly. And as you can see from our report, Florida is hardly alone in this. And again, I want to take this opportunity to mention that just because folks are not listed in that top 20 does not mean they are safe. There are no places in the United States that can be considered safe. The second question is from Ed Blazina with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette.
Good afternoon. The Secretary Buttigieg has, at the end of last year, declared war on traffic fatalities. Said we have way too many of them. That's pretty obvious. Is there enough federal emphasis, though, on the pedestrian element of that? And what can be done to change the billions of dollars that are being spent in those improvements?
That is a great question. The answer is no. There are not enough. There's not enough federal attention to pedestrian fatalities and pedestrian safety. I'd say there's not enough federal focus on safety at all. Safety is seen as a side project, and you can see that in the difference between the size of programs. The Highway Safety Improvement Program is about 6% of spending. The National Highway Performance Program and the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program equals 75% of spending. And safety is not a focus of those programs. That is a result of the bipartisan agreement on Capitol Hill, a bipartisan agreement to provide vast deference to the states, and the states are choosing to use their authority to prioritize speed over safety. And the feds seem to think it's sufficient to say, well, if you just preserve this little piece of funding for safety, it will all even out. But 6% of funding does not even out against 75% of funding. And that's why that strategy, which we've employed since the early 1990s, of creating little bitty programs to fix the problem that is ongoing with the big programs, has failed year after year after year. Every dollar has to improve safety, which means our overall standards and rules and priorities and performance measures all have to change top to bottom, like the work we're seeing under Councilmember Poduri and under the mayor of Tucson. They are looking to change their standards to build a different product with every dollar spent. And we need that from the feds, and we are far from that. Our next question is from Rick Neal from Florida Today.
Yes, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Yeah, I want to piggyback. I didn't catch the reporter's name from Daytona, who was just what? Yeah, jumping back in regarding Florida, just regarding these metro areas in general. Clearly, these are all skewing. All of them are located in the southern United States. How much is weather? I mean, I've asked you guys this before in your statistical analysis. How much is, year-round pedestrian activity? I mean, how how great a factor is that? I mean, again, this is as of last year, 8 of the top 11 metro areas were in Florida. This looks like 7 of the top 20. Growth in road design, I don't see how that's, looking at this map, I just don't see how that's that large of a factor. I mean, can you guys explain to me, like, I mean, this is extremely Florida centric, apparently completely warm weather centric as well,
It is warm weather centric. It is also centered on the areas that saw most of their growth after World War II and after the car was readily available. So you see large areas that built up in a very car-centric way. We try to use a methodology that takes into consideration the number of people walking. And in fact, in previous reports, we used the number of people walking to work as a proxy for how much pedestrian activity we see in the area. We did not choose to use that for 2020 since because of the COVID shutdown, there were not people walking to work. But it really is not, the danger does not reflect where people are walking. In fact, where people are walking more often tend to be safer. And a lot of these communities in the South do not have as many people walking along the roadways because of the danger. So, when you look across the world, really, you see that so many regions have similar challenges to the United States. It turns out we're not the only country in the world with iPhones. That distraction exists across the world. That we're not the only country in the world that has some reckless behavior and issues like drinking and driving. What we have that's different is a highway-centric default design that sends a message to the driver that they should go very quickly, they should move fast, but that they should stop on a dime if there's any conflict. And when they inevitably mess up, we say that's human error, and we never look at the design of the roadway that created the opportunity for the mistake. And other countries have, and they don't have the same result as we do. I will tell you that up north, I find folks in very, very cold weather out and about. They've got in Minneapolis, you can see some pretty extensive, incredible numbers for people walking and biking. They're just made of a tough material. So it is not a matter of who is out or how many people are out. It really is a matter of a system set up to create deadly mistakes. The next question we have is from Lucas Fenton with I'm sorry, it's Dan Zakowski with Smart Cities Dive.
Hi, Beth. Thanks for taking my question.
Sure.
Do you have any examples of cities that are perhaps exemplars of or the right way of doing this, that are safe cities?
Well, we do in the report look at those communities that have been making some progress. This is something we really wanted to spend time on, and the National Complete Streets Coalition specifically asked that we put some attention to, because we want to get a sense of how to do better. And we do have a list of cities in the report that have seen some marginal improvements in safety. And I mentioned some of the states that are not doing as poorly as other states that have seen their numbers improve. Unfortunately, there really are no examples in this country of cities doing great. We see examples of corridors being improved. Mr. Martinez talked about the corridor where his son was killed being improved afterwards. But one corridor does not change an entire community. Unfortunately, that highway-centric approach is the default, and we are picking away at it while continuing to build unsafe conditions at the same time. So if we really want to see a change, we're going to see more complete streets built than highway-style streets to start to tip the things in a safer direction. I do want to invite our other speakers to join in. If you all want to say something, just give me a little indication and I'll make sure you get a chance to answer the question too. All right, Lucas Fenton, this time for real with the Memphis commercial appeal.
Thank you. So Memphis is it's pretty spread out, and it's not a very walkable city from point A to point B. And also our public transportation isn't the greatest. And considering how much people would use it if it were more consistent and more readily available, how does that really play into pedestrian deaths when you're kind of left without that option of public transport?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think Memphis is a good example of what we face across the country. Most American cities are very spread out. Most have pretty marginal transit. And most, well, all really are dominated by a very highway style roadway design. But I think you point out an interesting point of interaction between the transit service and the lack of pedestrian safety. Every transit trip starts and ends with a walking trip. So if it's not safe to walk to or from transit, you haven't provided good transit. Unfortunately, the transit agencies have almost no say about the safety of the roadways that they operate on or operate near. And many times the roadway designers don't see access to transit as one of their jobs or movement of transit as one of their jobs. Very few are even trained in what it means to design a roadway for transit operations or transit riders. I would like to note that if you look at just bus stops in general, they're often placed kind of on the side of a highway where there's no real access to the bus stop except for to walk on the roadway. And then you're often kind of standing off of what is for all intents and purposes a highway, where you'll see traffic going 55 miles per hour past you. That's very uncomfortable, but it's the result of that roadway danger is held against the transit system. And then that can be an excuse to not put as much money into transit. So there is a definite feedback loop there that is very negative and does not help us invest in transit. The lack of people outside of a car, the fact that they're forced to drive everywhere, even very short distances to be safe, is then used as an excuse to not build the facilities for transit or for biking and walking. I can think about where my brother lives outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and he is within 4 blocks of a grocery store, but to get there would require him to walk in 45-mile-per-hour truck traffic. And because he doesn't do that, that is used, and no one does that because they're all rational. That's an example that is used, and I've heard it used by policymakers in the region for why we don't need sidewalks and we don't need transit because everyone just loves to drive. So these feedback loops are very dangerous, and these are the sorts of myths we really need to pick apart.
Thank you.
Dan Bach from Route 50.
Hi, Beth.
Dan.
Thanks for having this call. I have 2 somewhat related questions, but when you talk about the post-World War II sort of auto-centric sort of communities, I'm wondering why it seems like people pointed out Florida is heavily represented, and I don't know where in the ranking like Atlanta is, or Denver, or not Denver, but like Dallas, Houston. It just seems like Texas and Georgia would seem to be all the characteristics that you have mentioned would have also apply there, and also to say LA. San Diego, that kind of deal. So is there something in the methodology that makes this more sort of skewed towards mid-range cities? And then I have another question if we have time.
Sure, I just looked it up. Atlanta was around 27. I think Denver
Okay.
was much higher, 54.
I meant Dallas, but yeah.
Oh, Dallas, I can find Dallas for you too. Let's see, Dallas is 44. It could be, I mean, if we could really dig in deep on each of these cities individually, and maybe this is something the reporters on this phone call could do, looking at specifics about where the most dangerous roads are, where the crashes are occurring, different destinations, income levels, the amount of walking and biking, those sorts of things all interplay. But I will say some states had the money at the right time to build the widest roads in particular places. I was just recently visiting relatives in Florida, in Southern Florida, and they have a very sophisticated super block system with very wide, very fast roadways. And it's systematized there in a way that I haven't seen every place. So there could be very localized factors that have to do with who had the money to reconstruct the roadway or to build them in these ways. I know in my home state of Louisiana, they didn't have the money in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to build such big roads in so many places. So that might keep some of Louisiana cities a little bit lower in the rankings. But there's a lot at play here. What we know is the place where we differ the most from our peers is in having such high speeds accommodated in our regular community roadways. That kind of high speed is, like I said, something that can create an atmosphere that makes mistakes easier and more consequential.
And if I could, just maybe final thoughts on this, but you'd mentioned that congestion during the pandemic had sort of slowed people down. And yet when congestion returned, we had the estimates are the pedestrian deaths went up. Is it that people just never, like they got used to speeding and never slowed down again? Or do you have any sense as to why even after the congestion, the pedestrian deaths are rising?
Yeah, so congestion before COVID did slow folks down, and it was much more concentrated than now. So we saw congestion drop off and free-flowing conditions reign across the country in 2020. If you look again at our partners at Streetlight Data, who helped us analyze the amount of pedestrian behavior or the increase in pedestrian activity over COVID, they also have really interesting and helpful information about congestion. It has not returned to 2019 levels. It is still substantially down. And interestingly, it's changed time of day. So we don't have near the morning peak. Morning peak is still it's way low compared to 2019. And then after lunchtime, you'll see a slow increase with a surprisingly high amount of traffic in that kind of school let out time, the 3 to 6, and then it kind of rounds and comes back down. So the way traffic has returned, and it is not returned close to 2019 levels, it is returned in a very different way, allowing higher speeds to occur through a greater portion of the day than occurred pre-pandemic. And so looking at some of the actual congestion data that are out there that folks like INRIX and TomTom use can be really interesting on the safety side, because you'll notice that where those speeds are highest, which they define as congestion free, is also often where the crashes are. Do we have anybody else? Would any of my co-presenters like to share any final thoughts before we close down? Mr. Martinez, Councilmember Poduri?
I would like to state that it is really disheartening to see that we're creating all these reports every year and things don't go down. But on a heartening note, I would say that I have seen certainly a lot of elected officials on my side, at least, picking up interest on what needs to be done the right way. And I do think that it needs to be incremental in nature on every topic, including this one. And while we examine policies and structures and all that, it may not be a bad idea for communities to think about a project that they think is really bad in their town or city and see how you can use that as an example to push policies forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, again, I want to thank all of our speakers, and I really just I have to specifically thank you all, Mr. Martinez, Mayor Romero, and Councilmember Poduri for your work in this area and your focus on this frustrating and challenging and persistent problem in the country. I also, and I want to thank my colleagues who are on the call, Rayla, Bellis, and Steve Davis, and Eric Kova. I also need to thank the CDC, whose funding made it possible for us to do this report. I also want to thank the partners who participated in this report. We have several partners who were featured in the report, from the National Association of City Transportation Officials, Strong Towns, the Fines and Fees Justice Institute, and all talking about connected issues like ways that we can tackle this issue, how an engineer approaches these projects, and why focusing only on enforcement, or so strongly on enforcement, ignores a big part of the problem and exacerbates a lot of the inequities of our transportation system. So big thank you to all of them, and I recommend taking a look at their work. I also want to say that this is 100% doable. Other countries have tackled these problems and have addressed it. And while we like to think of ourselves as totally different from everybody else in the world, and we are, there are lessons to be learned. We are seeing fatalities on 15% of roadways. Those arterials, those big wide roads, are dominating the danger. They are 60% of the fatalities on 15% of the roads. We can tackle 15% of the roads, and if we do that, we could have an incredible shift in these numbers in a pretty short period of time. We could be back here in 5 or 10 years with incredibly different results. We should not accept this as inevitable, and we should not write this off as, well, you know, Americans, they're just inherently dangerous. We are not. We can do better. We should be saving lives. Others have done it, and we can do it too. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to Eric or Valerie Holford, and their information was provided in our invitation. I want to remind you all that this report is embargoed until midnight, 12:01 tomorrow. So please keep it close hold until then. Thank you all so much for participating today.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.